She is a drug addict, my mother roared in court. I sat quietly. The judge turned to her and asked if she was sure she knew what I did for a living. Her lawyer froze. My father's face went pale. Wait, no. My name is Audrey Reynolds and I am 33 years old. I run an empire that my family could not even begin to comprehend. But they had to learn the hard way. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood meant keeping up appearances at all costs. My parents, Patricia and Richard, valued their country club status above oxygen. I was the eldest daughter, but I was never the favorite. That title belonged to my younger sister, Melanie. I was the scapegoat, the designated failure, the one they blamed for every blemish on their perfect family portrait. They spent decades tearing down my confidence, belittling my ambitions, and attempting to force me into a mold of subservience. They thought I was a broken minimum wage worker who would simply bow to their demands. They thought wrong. The turning point happened precisely at 6:30 p.m. on Thanksgiving evening. The dining room of my parents' sprawling estate was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted turkey and the overwhelming stench of my mother's expensive perfume. I had barely taken my seat at the end of the long mahogany table. I had not even picked up my fork when the atmosphere shifted from tense to violently hostile. Patricia did not offer a prayer or a toast. Instead, she marched around the table and violently slammed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents directly onto my plate. The impact shattered the delicate china. Hot gravy and mashed potatoes splashed across my dark blouse and stained the pristine white tablecloth. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I slowly looked up from the ruined food to meet my mother's furious, entirely unapologetic gaze. "Sign it," Patricia commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Sign it right now, Audrey. We are done playing games with your life." I picked up a napkin, carefully wiped a streak of gravy from my cheek, and looked down at the bold, terrifying font on the front page of the document. It was a formal petition for a total legal and financial conservatorship. They were filing to strip me of my basic human rights. "What exactly is this, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Do not play stupid with me," she spat, slamming her hands on the table and leaning directly into my space. "You are a 33-year-old high school graduate working a minimum wage job at some rundown community clinic. You have no assets, no future, and absolutely no ability to care for yourself. You are signing this conservatorship tonight so we can protect your grandfather's $5 million trust fund from your drug habits." My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, cutting a piece of turkey with exaggerated precision. "Listen to your mother, Audrey," he said without looking up from his meal. "You have been a burden on this family for too long. Your erratic behavior and your substance abuse are tearing us apart. We have filed the paperwork with the court. The judge will grant us full control over your finances and your medical decisions. It is for your own good. We cannot let an addict squander $5 million. I looked at the documents again. Grandfather Thomas had recently passed away, leaving his substantial trust to me. He was the only person in this family who ever saw my true potential. He knew I was not the failure my parents painted me to be. My parents, however, were drowning in hidden debt. They needed that money to maintain their lavish lifestyle, and they were willing to legally enslave me to get it. "You want to take control of my inheritance," I stated clearly, ensuring there was no misunderstanding. "You want to declare me mentally incompetent and label me an addict to steal my grandfather's money? We want to save your life," Patricia shrieked, playing to the imaginary audience she always envisioned watching her. "You are a danger to yourself. You live in a tiny, pathetic apartment. You wear cheap clothes. You refuse to get a real career. We will take over the trust, administer a strict allowance for your basic needs, and ensure you get the psychiatric help you desperately require. Now pick up a pen and sign the waiver of rights." I stared at the woman who had birthed me. I saw nothing but pure, unadulterated greed hiding behind a mask of maternal concern. She wanted me powerless. She wanted me legally bound to her so she could drain the trust fund dry. She assumed I was weak because I chose to live quietly, keeping my massive corporate success entirely hidden from their toxic judging eyes. I reached across the table. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen lying next to my father's wine glass. Patricia's eyes lit up with triumphant satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought the years of breaking my spirit had finally culminated in my total surrender. She crossed her arms, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face, as she watched me bring the pen toward the signature line. I hovered the gold tip just a millimeter above the paper. Then I closed my fist around the pen. With one swift, violent motion, I snapped the expensive metal pen completely in half. Ink exploded across the conservatorship documents, ruining the pristine pages. I dropped the broken pieces onto the gravy-stained paper. "I would rather burn the money than give you a single cent," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the dining room. The sharp crack of the breaking pen sent a shockwave through the dining room. For a fraction of a second, nobody breathed. Then the silence shattered. My younger sister Melanie sprang up from her chair. She knocked her wine glass over, sending a pool of red liquid spilling across the table. She clutched her pregnant stomach, her face twisting into a mask of exaggerated agony. "You are completely psychotic!" Melanie screamed, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "You always do this. You always ruin every holiday. You are selfish, crazy, and completely out of control. Mom and Dad are just trying to save your pathetic life, and you sit there acting like you are better than us." I remained perfectly still in my chair. I simply watched my sister perform the exact routine she had perfected since childhood. Whenever I showed a spine, Melanie played the victim. "You are a drug addict, Audrey." Melanie continued, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You dropped out of college when you were 20 years old because you could not handle the pressure. You stole my savings to buy your pills. You ruined your own life, and now you want to drag all of us down into the mud with you. You owe this family for dealing with your absolute failure of an existence." I slowly stood up from my chair. I picked up a clean napkin and wiped the splashed ink from my fingers. I looked directly into Melanie's tear-filled eyes, refusing to let her look away. "Let us get the history completely straight, Melanie," I said, projecting my voice so every word landed like a physical blow. "I did not drop out of college because I could not handle the pressure. I was forced to leave my university exactly 13 years ago because Mom and Dad secretly drained my entire college tuition fund." Patricia gasped, taking a step back. "That is a lie," she sputtered defensively. "We needed that money for household expenses." "Household expenses?" I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You drained my tuition fund to buy Melanie a brand new Porsche 911 for her 18th birthday. You went to the dealership on Westheimer Road on a Tuesday afternoon. You wrote a cashier's check for $85,000, pulling it directly from the educational trust grandfather had set up for me. I had to leave school because you literally stole my future to buy your golden child a luxury sports car." Melanie's face turned bright red. "That was my gift," she yelled defensively. "I deserved that car. I was pre-med. I was making them proud. You dropped out of pre-med 3 months later to become a lifestyle influencer." I shot back instantly. "And speaking of stealing savings, let us talk about your current financial situation, little sister. You claim I stole your money for drugs. That is a fascinating accusation considering your bank accounts are currently empty." Melanie froze. She glanced nervously at her husband Jamal, who was sitting rigidly next to her. Jamal's jaw clenched tightly. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, finally dropping his knife and fork. "Melanie has plenty of savings. Jamal manages her portfolio." I turned my cold gaze toward my father. "Jamal manages nothing but his own ego," I stated clearly. "Ask your brilliant son-in-law where Melanie's savings actually went. Ask him about the aggressive crypto investments and the highly leveraged stock options he purchased last month. Ask him how he managed to lose every single penny of her savings in a matter of weeks, leaving them drowning in massive debt." Melanie whipped her head around to stare at Jamal. Her fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by genuine panic. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Melanie demanded, grabbing his tailored sleeve. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her my accounts are fine." Jamal roughly pulled his arm away from her grasp. He refused to look his wife in the eye. A heavy, suffocating tension filled the room as the reality of my words sank in. I had spent the last decade building a billion-dollar forensic toxicology empire, but I also made it my business to know everything about the people trying to destroy me. I possessed an entire intelligence network at my disposal, and I knew exactly how deep Jamal's financial ruin truly went. You see, Melanie? I continued, my voice steady and merciless. The only reason Mom and Dad are trying to force this conservatorship on me is because they need my $5 million to bail your husband out of his massive financial disaster. They are not trying to save my life. They are trying to save their own country club reputation from the embarrassment of your impending bankruptcy. Patricia slammed her hand hard against the back of her chair. "Shut your mouth right now, Audrey," she shrieked, her perfectly manicured facade completely dissolving into rage. "You know nothing about high finance. You know nothing about investments. You are a delusional addict making up crazy stories to deflect from your own pathetic reality. You will sign those papers, or we will have you forcefully committed to a psychiatric ward by Monday morning. We have the medical evidence to prove you are a danger to society." I looked at the ruined conservatorship documents covered in ink and gravy. I felt no sorrow. I felt no betrayal. The family I once wanted to love had officially declared war, and I was more than ready to oblige them. They wanted to play games with legal documents and fake medical evidence. They had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the predator they had just awakened. The dining room felt like a powder keg ready to ignite. Jamal pushed his chair back with a loud, aggressive scrape against the hardwood floor. He stood up, towering over the table. Jamal was an imposing African-American man who took extreme pride in his physical appearance and his corporate title. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my first car. A heavy, solid gold Rolex gleamed on his wrist under the chandelier light. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his sheer physical presence and his perceived financial superiority to intimidate me into submission. "Listen to me very carefully, Dropout," Jamal growled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You do not get to come into this house and disrespect me. You do not get to make wild accusations about my financial portfolio. I am a vice president of investments at a top-tier brokerage firm. I manage hundreds of millions of dollars for actual important clients. You are a nobody. You are a washed-up loser working at a free clinic who cannot even afford a decent haircut." I crossed my arms and held my ground, completely unbothered by his posturing. "Keep talking, Jamal," I said calmly. "Your arrogance is highly entertaining." "You think this is a joke?" Jamal scoffed, taking a step toward me. He gestured aggressively toward the ruined papers on the table. "You think breaking a pen changes anything? We hold all the cards here, Audrey. We have already filed the emergency injunction with the county court. We have top-tier lawyers on retainer. The judge is going to look at your non-existent career, your lack of assets, and your completely unstable behavior. Then the judge is going to look at our family. They will see upstanding citizens, successful executives, and loving parents trying to save their sick daughter." Richard chimed in from the head of the table, his voice oozing with false sympathy. "Jamal is right. The legal system favors the responsible, Audrey. You cannot fight this. You are going to sign over that trust fund." Jamal continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you make this difficult, I will personally ensure the court strips you of every single right you possess. We will take control of your bank accounts, your medical decisions, and your living arrangements. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my direct legal authorization. You will be a ward of this family and you will obey our rules. Do you understand me, you pathetic addict?" I listened to his entire arrogant speech without blinking. I memorized every threat, every insult, every piece of foolish bravado. They truly believed their own narrative. They believed their expensive clothes and country club memberships made them invincible. They believed my silence over the years was a sign of weakness, rather than a symptom of my extreme focus on building my corporate empire. I uncrossed my arms. I slowly picked up my simple, unassuming wool coat from the back of my chair. I slipped it on, taking my time, letting the silence stretch out and make them uncomfortable. I picked up my purse and finally turned my full attention back to Jamal. "You talk a big game for a man who is secretly drowning in debt." Jamal, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone. You threaten me with the legal system, but you clearly have no idea how the law actually works. You cannot force a conservatorship without hard, irrefutable medical evidence of severe substance abuse and mental incompetence. Patricia let out a loud, triumphant cackle. She pulled a secondary folder from the sideboard and slapped it down on the table. We have the evidence, Audrey. We hired Dr. Vance to review your history. We submitted a comprehensive medical profile to the court. We submitted lab results, proving you are actively using narcotics. You cannot fight scientific proof. The judge will grant the order based on the toxicology reports alone. I stared at the secondary folder. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. They had clearly bribed a shady doctor to write a fake psychological evaluation, and they had managed to procure a falsified drug test. They were committing massive coordinated fraud to steal $5 million. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that caused Jamal to briefly falter. You submitted lab results, I repeated, nodding slowly. That is incredibly fascinating, Patricia. I sincerely hope you paid a lot of money for those fake medical bills and those forged toxicology reports. Because submitting fabricated evidence to a state judge is a serious felony. We did not fake anything, Richard shouted, standing up abruptly, his face flushing with anger. Those are official documents from a highly respected medical laboratory. I turned and walked toward the dining room exit. I stopped right at the doorway and looked back at my family. They looked like a pack of rabid wolves, desperate, greedy, and completely clueless about the trap they had just walked into. See you in court, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the large room. Make sure you bring every single one of those forged medical documents. Make sure you present them proudly to the judge. Bring your lawyers. Bring your arrogant attitude. Do not hold anything back. Audrey, you get back here right now, Patricia screamed, rushing around the table. You cannot run away from this. I am not running, Patricia, I replied smoothly. I am just going back to my pathetic, unsuccessful life. I will see you all at the hearing. Please make sure you dress your best. I want you to look fantastic when your entire world collapses. It is going to be a very fun show. I walked out the front door, leaving them shouting in the dining room. The cold November air hit my face, refreshing and sharp. The battle lines were officially drawn. They wanted to steal my grandfather's trust fund. They wanted to destroy my life. But I was Audrey Reynolds, CEO of Apex Tox Labs, and I was going to bury them all. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, biting chill that heavily frosted the floor-to-ceiling windows of my private penthouse office. I sat comfortably in my custom $20,000 ergonomic leather chair, overlooking the downtown skyline. The bustling city below moved at a frantic pace, completely oblivious to the quiet corporate empire I operated from the 40th floor. My desk was a sleek slab of black marble, completely clear, except for my dual monitors and a steaming cup of black coffee. I had spent the weekend finalizing a massive acquisition, pushing the Thanksgiving ambush to the back of my mind. My parents and my arrogant brother-in-law had promised a legal war. I was simply waiting for them to make their first pathetic move. My personal cell phone buzzed against the marble surface. It was a device I kept entirely separate from my highly secure corporate network, a cheap decoy phone tied directly to the modest identity my family still believed I lived. The screen lit up with a text message from my father. I picked it up, expecting another barrage of threats or perhaps a fake apology meant to lure me back into their grasp. Instead, Richard had decided to strike where he thought it would hurt the most. Your bank accounts are officially frozen, the message read. Patricia and I filed an emergency ex parte order first thing this morning. The judge agreed that your erratic behavior warrants immediate financial intervention. Your debit cards will decline everywhere. You have absolutely zero access to cash. Come home, beg for our forgiveness, and sign the conservatorship papers. If you cooperate, I will give you $50 so you can buy yourself some groceries. Do not test me, Audrey. You cannot survive out there with nothing. I read the text twice. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips, breaking the absolute silence of my office. They truly thought they had cornered me. They actually believed that shutting down a basic checking account would bring me to my knees. What Richard and Patricia did not realize was that the account they had just frozen was a carefully maintained decoy. It contained exactly $5,000. I kept it active and transferred small, regular amounts into it for over a decade just to maintain the illusion of a struggling clinic worker. It was a cardboard cutout, and my parents had just spent thousands in legal fees to conquer it. I set the decoy phone face down on the desk and turned my attention to my secure primary workstation. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint, granting me immediate access to the executive financial portal of Apex Talks Labs. As the chief executive officer, I had unrestricted control over billions of dollars in corporate assets and personal investments. The $5 million trust fund my grandfather left me, the very same trust my parents were committing federal fraud to steal, was a fraction of my actual net worth. However, I was not about to leave that money vulnerable to a corrupt judge. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I navigated past the primary corporate holdings and accessed a series of offshore ghost accounts I had established for high-level acquisitions. With a few precise clicks, I initiated a wire transfer. I moved exactly $5 million of my legitimate, untraceable capital into an encrypted corporate shell account. The transaction cleared in less than 4 seconds. The money was now shielded behind layers of corporate privilege, completely invisible to any standard domestic subpoena. Let them try to claim a drained decoy account. Let Jamal sweat over the empty promise of collateral he just bragged about. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My family had played their opening hand with predictable arrogance. They assumed I was weak because I had allowed them to believe it. They mistook my silence for submission, my strategic distance for failure. My father genuinely believed $50 and a bag of groceries would break my spirit. He had no concept of the predator he had just provoked. I was going to make sure they never recovered from the financial devastation they were carelessly inviting into their lives. I opened my email to draft a directive to my legal team, instructing them to monitor the county court dockets for any further filings under my name. I wanted to know the exact moment David Thorne submitted those forged toxicology reports. I needed every piece of their fraudulent puzzle perfectly documented before I sprang the trap. I was going to let them walk into that courtroom feeling like champions. I was going to let Patricia cry her fake tears. And then I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. Just as I hit send on the email to my lead counsel, a sharp, distinct chime echoed from my computer speakers. It was not a standard email notification or a calendar reminder. It was the urgent override alert from my internal human resources communications channel. A bright red dialog box popped up in the center of my screen, indicating a direct high-priority message from the head of my HR department. I frowned, setting my coffee cup down. It was highly unusual for HR to bypass my executive assistant and ping my personal terminal directly unless there was a critical security breach or a major personnel crisis. I immediately clicked on the notification, opening the secure chat window. The message from the HR director was brief but alarming. Madam, I apologize for the direct interruption. We are currently dealing with a highly irregular situation on line 2. There is an aggressive individual on the phone claiming to be your brother-in-law. He is citing your full legal name and demanding to speak with someone in management regarding your immediate termination. He claims to have hard evidence of gross misconduct and illegal drug use on company property. Please advise us on how you want security to proceed. I stared at the blinking red notification on my secure monitor. The message from my human resources director was highly unusual, but the name mentioned in the alert made perfect sense. Jamal. My brother-in-law was not a man who knew how to wait. He thrived on immediate gratification and public displays of power. Finding that my small checking account had been frozen was not enough for him. He needed to ruin me. He wanted my only real income cut off completely. I reached across my marble desk and tapped a sequence of keys on my secondary terminal. As the chief executive officer of Apex Talks Labs, I had absolute administrative access to every communication channel in the building. I bypassed the standard security protocols and silently patched myself into the active call on line 2. I did not announce my presence. I simply muted my microphone and listened as Jamal attempted to orchestrate my professional destruction. His voice echoed through my premium office speakers, dripping with his signature blend of faux concern and extreme arrogance. "You need to understand the severe liability your company is currently facing," Jamal was saying. His tone was loud, commanding, and heavily practiced. "I am calling as a concerned family member, but I am also calling as a vice president of investments at a major financial institution. I know how corporate risk works. You have a lab technician named Audrey Reynolds working in your facility. She handles sensitive biological samples, and she is an active, dangerous narcotics addict." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and smiled. Jamal was truly putting on a masterclass in manipulation. He was using his corporate title to bully whoever had answered the phone in human resources. He assumed Apex Tox Labs was just a modest clinic, a place where a loud, aggressive man in a designer suit could easily intimidate the middle management. The human resources representative on the line sounded incredibly confused. "Sir, I am trying to understand your claim," she said politely. "You are stating that Audrey Reynolds is a liability to our operations. Are you aware of her exact position within this organization?" "I am aware that she is a failure who dropped out of college 13 years ago," Jamal snapped, cutting the representative off completely. "I know exactly who she is because my family has been financially supporting her pathetic existence for over a decade. She consistently lies about her whereabouts. Now my parents-in-law are currently filing for an emergency legal conservatorship to place her in a mandatory psychiatric facility. We have the medical documents proving her substance abuse. If you allow her to continue handling medical materials, your entire laboratory could face massive federal lawsuits when she inevitably makes a catastrophic mistake." Jamal paused, clearly expecting the human resources representative to gasp in horror and thank him for his incredible vigilance. He expected them to panic. He expected them to fire the low-level lab tech immediately to avoid any legal trouble. Instead, there was a long, awkward silence on the call. I could picture the poor human resources representative staring at her computer screen, looking at the corporate hierarchy chart, and seeing my name at the very top of the pyramid. "Sir," the representative finally replied, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed amusement. "I appreciate your concern for our corporate liability. However, I cannot process a termination request over the phone based on external allegations. Furthermore, the individual you are referencing is not a standard laboratory technician. I do not care what her specific job title is," Jamal barked. "You clearly do not understand who you are speaking to. I manage high-net-worth portfolios. I know how to destroy a corporate reputation if they refuse to mitigate a clear and present danger. You will terminate Audrey Reynolds immediately. You will escort her out of your building. If you refuse, I will report your facility for employing a severe addict. I will ruin your entire operation. Do I make myself clear?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Jamal was openly threatening a billion-dollar biotech firm, completely unaware that he was speaking to a company that could buy his entire investment brokerage with spare petty cash. He was digging his own grave. "I want to speak to the head of your department," Jamal demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "I want to speak to the highest-ranking person in your human resources division right now. Put your director on the phone immediately before I decide to involve our legal team." "Please hold for a moment, sir," the representative said, her voice remaining perfectly professional despite the barrage of insults. "I will transfer your call to our Human Resources Director, Evelyn Carter." The line clicked, and the generic corporate hold music began to play softly through my speakers. I imagined Jamal sitting in his office, adjusting his expensive watch, feeling like a conquering hero. He probably thought I would be crying in my car within the hour, begging my parents for that $50 they promised me. I picked up my secure mobile device and quickly typed a text message to Evelyn. "Do not hang up on the arrogant man on line 2. I want to handle this personally. Come to my office right now." I set the phone down and waited. The hold music continued to play, a cheerful tune that perfectly contrasted with the lethal trap I was setting. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy glass door to my penthouse office swung open. Evelyn Carter, my director of human resources, stood in the doorway. She was clutching a digital tablet, her face a mixture of pure disbelief and professional outrage. Evelyn closed the heavy glass door securely and took 2 steps into my large office. She looked at me sitting behind my marble desk, then down at her tablet. "Ma'am, your brother-in-law is online too, demanding we fire you." I stared at Evelyn Carter, my director of human resources, who looked as though she wanted to reach through the phone and strangle the man on the other end. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I muted my microphone and gestured for Evelyn to sit in the plush leather chair opposite my desk. "Put him on speaker," I whispered softly. Evelyn tapped her digital tablet, and Jamal's aggressive voice filled my office again. He was right in the middle of a self-important tirade. "I am losing my patience with you people," Jamal barked through the speaker. "If you do not terminate Audrey Reynolds immediately, I will personally see to it that your little clinic is audited by the state medical board. Do you have any idea the kind of leverage I wield in this city? I can make one phone call and have your funding completely pulled." I nodded to Evelyn and typed a quick message on my monitor, turning the screen slightly so she could read it. "Play along. Give him exactly what he wants, but keep the wording legally ambiguous." Evelyn, a seasoned corporate veteran who had navigated far worse crises than an angry, entitled brother-in-law, cleared her throat and adjusted her tone to sound appropriately intimidated. "Sir, please lower your voice," Evelyn said, feigning a sense of mounting panic. "We take allegations of substance abuse very seriously here. We absolutely cannot risk our facility's reputation or our patient safety. If what you are saying about Ms. Reynolds is true, we have no choice but to act immediately." "It is absolutely true," Jamal insisted, his arrogance swelling audibly through the connection. "I am doing your clinic a massive favor. Fire her, now." I typed another instruction for Evelyn. "Tell him it is done. Tell him you will send written confirmation." Sir Evelyn said, her voice shaking slightly for maximum dramatic effect. "I have just dispatched our internal security team to Ms. Reynolds' workstation. She will be dealt with immediately and escorted off the premises. If you provide your email address, I can send you a formal confirmation of this action to keep for your family records." Jamal let out a loud, victorious sigh. Finally, someone in this pathetic building knows how to follow basic directions. He quickly rattled off his corporate email address, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was handing over direct contact information to a company that could track his digital footprint back to the Stone Age. "Make sure that email clearly reflects that she was removed as a dangerous liability." "Understood," Sir Evelyn replied dutifully. "Have a good day." She ended the call and looked at me, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Are we actually sending this man a confirmation email?" "Absolutely," I said, leaning back in my $20,000 chair. "Draft a message from a generic human resources alias. State that employee Audrey Reynolds has been dealt with and formally escorted off the laboratory premises. Do not mention termination. Do not mention drugs. Just state she has been removed from the building." Evelyn smirked, catching on immediately. "Because you are leaving for the day and your private security detail always escorts you to the private garage." "Exactly," I said. "It is entirely factually accurate. Let him hang himself with his own assumptions." An hour later, I was standing in the living room of my private penthouse, overlooking the glittering city skyline. The transition from my executive office to my residence was seamless, a luxury of owning the entire top 2 floors of the financial tower. I poured myself a glass of vintage champagne, the crystal flute cold against my skin. My primary laptop was open on the massive granite kitchen island, displaying rows of complex financial data. Beside it sat my cheap, cracked decoy phone. It vibrated violently, sliding a few inches across the stone countertop. I picked it up. The family group chat, which I had muted months ago, was suddenly exploding with rapid notifications. Jamal had not wasted a single second. He had taken a screenshot of Evelyn's vague, non-binding email and posted it directly into the chat for everyone to admire. "Problem solved," Jamal typed underneath the image. I called the clinic where Audrey works and spoke directly to their human resources director. I informed them about her severe drug habits and erratic behavior. They had their security guards escort her out of the building. She is officially unemployed. The responses from my family poured in immediately, a sickening display of coordinated cruelty and false concern. My mother, Patricia, replied first. Thank God. Now she has absolutely no income to fight the conservatorship in court. Excellent work, Jamal. We need to cut off all her financial resources so she finally hits rock bottom. My father, Richard, chimed in seconds later. She brought this entirely on herself. When she realizes she cannot afford to eat or pay her rent, she will sign the medical papers. We just have to hold the line and ignore her manipulation. Then came Melanie, my sister, the golden child, who was currently sitting on a mountain of hidden debt while pretending to live a flawless country club life. It breaks my heart, but tough love is the only way to save an addict. Audrey needs to realize we are doing this to protect her. Losing her job is the wake-up call she so desperately needs right now. I read the text messages while taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne. The absolute unhinged delusion was staggering. They were congratulating themselves for destroying a minimum wage job that did not even exist. They were high on the false power of their own deception, entirely convinced they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought taking away my fictional paycheck would leave me starving and desperate. They had no idea they were throwing pebbles at an impenetrable fortress. I set the decoy phone down and turned my full attention back to my primary laptop. On the high-resolution screen was the complete corporate profile for Vanguard Horizon Group, the boutique investment firm where Jamal served as a vice president. It was a moderately successful firm catering to upper-middle-class clients who wanted to feel like Wall Street elites. My intelligence team had spent the entire weekend digging through Vanguard's public and private filings. What they found was a company severely over-leveraged, carrying massive toxic debts disguised as high-yield assets. Jamal was not the only one at that firm playing fast and loose with client money. The entire brokerage was a fragile house of cards just waiting for a strong gust of wind. I opened a highly secure encrypted portal linking directly to my chief financial officer. We had set up a ghost shell company 3 years ago, specifically for aggressive corporate acquisitions. It was a massive, untraceable slush fund, holding billions in liquid capital, completely insulated from my public identity at Apex Talks Labs. Jamal wanted to play games with my livelihood. He wanted to use his corporate title to threaten my employment and intimidate my staff. It was only fair that I returned the absolute favor. I typed a single decisive command to my chief financial officer. Initiate the Vanguard takeover protocol immediately. I hit the enter key. With that one single keystroke, my shell company began aggressively buying up Vanguard Horizon Group's majority debt. We were purchasing their leveraged loans, absorbing their corporate bonds, and quietly acquiring majority shareholder voting rights through shadow proxy buyers. It was a hostile corporate takeover executed with absolute clinical precision. By the time the financial markets opened the following morning, Vanguard Horizon Group would no longer belong to its founding partners. It would belong entirely to me. And the very first order of business for the new anonymous parent company would be a comprehensive, merciless financial audit of every single portfolio managed by their arrogant vice president. I finished my glass of champagne and looked out over the glowing city. Jamal had wanted to get me fired. He was about to find out what a real termination looked like. The feeling of absolute triumph was a drug that Jamal could not resist. He sat in his corner office at Vanguard Horizon Group, a smug grin plastered across his face as he stared at his pristine touchscreen tablet. The family group chat was still buzzing with messages of adoration and praise from Patricia and Melanie. In their eyes, he was the brilliant savior who had finally brought the rebellious, drug-addicted middle child to heel. He had broken Audrey's financial lifeline, or so he firmly believed, and left her completely at the mercy of their impending legal trap. But as the initial high of his corporate bullying began to fade, the cold, suffocating weight of reality crept back into the room. Jamal's hands began to sweat against the polished mahogany of his desk. He opened a hidden, encrypted spreadsheet on his secondary monitor, the green and red numbers reflecting a truth that would immediately send him to a federal penitentiary if it ever came to light. $3 million. That was the exact amount of client capital Jamal had systematically embezzled over the past 18 months to fund his reckless high-stakes options trading and his wife Melanie's extravagant country club lifestyle. He had shifted numbers, falsified quarterly performance reports, and brilliantly manipulated account data to hide the massive deficit. But his time had officially run out. A routine regulatory compliance audit was scheduled for the end of the week, and if that $3 million was not back in the primary escrow accounts by Friday afternoon, his entire life would collapse in an instant. Jamal rubbed his temples, his breathing turning shallow. His entire strategy for survival rested on the $5 million trust fund that my grandfather had left specifically to Audrey. Richard and Patricia were already using the temporary ex parte order to lock down her known accounts, and the forged toxicology reports from David Thorne would guarantee the absolute success of the conservatorship. Once Audrey was legally declared incompetent, the family would gain total administrative control over her inheritance. Jamal had already convinced Patricia that he should manage the funds through Vanguard to maximize the yields. He just needed a temporary bridge. He needed a massive backdoor institutional loan to cover the $3 million hole before the regulators arrived, and he needed it today. Jamal picked up his secure office phone and dialed a private unlisted number. The call routed directly to an elite shadow lender, a high-risk institutional credit firm that catered strictly to executives facing severe liquidity crises. It was an expensive cutthroat operation that charged exorbitant interest rates, but they asked zero questions as long as the collateral was ironclad. The line connected with a sharp click, and a cold professional voice answered. "This is Credit Risk Assessment. State your transaction ID." "This is Jamal Vance, Vanguard Horizon Group." He said, his voice instantly shifting into his practiced high-confidence sales pitch. "I am finalizing the emergency bridge loan we discussed yesterday. $3 million standard short-term corporate facilities." The lender on the other end tapped a sequence of keys. "I see the preliminary application, Mr. Vance. Your firm's current assets do not meet our minimum safety margins for a signature loan of this magnitude. You were instructed to provide secondary non-corporate collateral to secure the facility. Have you finalized those terms?" "Yes," Jamal said, a confident smirk returning to his face as he leaned back in his leather chair. "I am placing a $5 million liquid trust fund as the primary guarantee. The assets are currently held in a secure domestic account. My family is finalizing the absolute administrative control over the capital through a finalized court order this week. I have the ex parte documentation right here, proving our legal authority over the estate. The capital is completely secure, and it will be moved directly under my management by Thursday morning." The line went quiet for several long seconds as the shadow lender verified the data. "The documentation appears legitimate," the voice replied neutrally. "If the $5 million in liquid capital is positioned as an absolute irrevocable guarantee, our underwriters can approve the $3 million facility. I am uploading the final loan agreements to your secure portal now. We will require your digital signature along with a formal verification from your firm's parent holding company, Apex Financial Clearing." "I will sign them immediately," Jamal said, his heart hammering with a profound sense of relief. He could already see the finish line. He would slip the $3 million into the escrow accounts, clear the regulatory audit, and then quietly reimburse himself using Audrey's inheritance once the conservatorship was finalized. It was a flawless latkeo. He pulled up the digital documents, typed his secure PIN, and applied his executive signature to the loan agreement. He hit send, watching the progress bar reach 100%. The screen lit up with a green confirmation box, pending parent company verification. Jamal laughed out loud, tossing his gold pen onto the desk. He picked up his decoy phone and typed a quick update to Melanie. "The loan is signed," he wrote. "The audit will not find a single discrepancy. Audrey's inheritance is officially saving our lives, and she doesn't even know it. Tell your mother she can buy whatever she wants for the victory dinner." He set the phone down, took a deep breath, and waited for the final funds transfer notification to hit his corporate account. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The green box on his monitor remained frozen on the pending status. Jamal's brow furrowed. A strange, uneasy sensation settled in his stomach. A standard institutional bridge loan usually cleared the parent company's automated verification system within 2 minutes. He reached for his phone to call the compliance desk downstairs, but before his fingers could touch the receiver, his desk phone erupted into a loud, frantic ring. The caller ID displayed the private emergency line for Vanguard's chief executive officer. Jamal answered immediately, his voice tight. "Jamal Vance here. Jamal, what the hell did you just do?" The CEO shouted through the line, his voice completely unhinged by sheer panic. "Did you just attempt to clear a $3 million third-party credit facility using unverified external trust collateral? Sir, it is completely secured by an impending family estate." Jamal stammered, his confidence suddenly fracturing. "The underwriters already vetted the paperwork. It is just a routine compliance check." "It is not a check, Jamal," the CEO hissed, his breathing ragged. "The parent company's automated system just flagged your transaction as a critical risk violation. And it didn't just reject your loan, the entire system is locked down." "What do you mean, locked down?" Jamal asked, panic rising in his throat as he stood up from his chair. "Vanguard no longer has an independent compliance desk." The CEO whispered, his voice trembling with terror. "The entire system was overridden from the top. Our parent holding company was just completely bought out 40 minutes ago in a massive anonymous hostile corporate takeover. A multi-billion-dollar biotech conglomerate called Apex Tox Labs just seized majority control of our voting stock. Their executive team just froze every single active transaction, and they are launching an immediate forensic emergency audit of your specific portfolios right now. You are finished, Jamal." The transition from my high-security corporate penthouse to the designated decoy apartment required a complete shift in persona. I traded my tailored designer suit for a faded oversized collegiate sweater and worn denim. I left my encrypted devices on my marble desk, bringing only a standard prepaid mobile phone and a professional-grade digital audio recorder. I maintained the lease on a dilapidated ground-floor studio apartment in the garment district for precisely this kind of scenario. It cost me barely anything to keep the rent current, but the peeling floral wallpaper, the persistent drip of the kitchen faucet, and the lingering scent of damp radiator heat created the absolute perfect illusion of a desperate, failing woman. It was a pathetic, suffocating little box, but tonight it served as the ultimate stage for my family's final performance. I sat on the edge of a sagging thrift store sofa, the only piece of furniture in the main room, and waited in the dim light of a single floor lamp. The preliminary court hearing for the conservatorship was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I knew my family well enough to anticipate their movements. They would not leave anything to chance. They would try one final aggressive maneuver to force my compliance before stepping in front of a judge. Right on schedule, a sharp, impatient knock rattled the thin wooden frame of the front door. I reached beneath the sofa cushion and pressed the activation button on the audio recorder, verifying the steady green light before standing up. I opened the door to find my mother, Patricia, standing in the poorly lit hallway. She wore a tailored camel coat, pristine leather gloves, and a look of profound, painstakingly manufactured sorrow. She pushed past me, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her nose wrinkled in obvious disgust as she took in the bleak, cramped surroundings, her eyes sweeping over the scuffed linoleum and the barren kitchen counter. "Audrey," Patricia breathed, placing a gloved hand dramatically over her heart. "Look at how you are living in this place. It absolutely breaks a mother's heart to see her own child languishing in such terrible squalor. You look so thin, so exhausted." I crossed my arms tightly across my chest, offering her nothing but a blank, defeated stare. "What exactly do you want, Mom? It is late." And Patricia sighed heavily, unclasping her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of legal documents and placed them on the scratched coffee table with deliberate, heavy care. She sat down gingerly on the edge of the armchair opposite me, leaning forward with an expression she clearly believed conveyed deep, unconditional maternal concern. "We want to stop this ugliness right now," she said softly, reaching out as if to touch my knee before pulling back. Your father and we do not want to drag you through a humiliating, highly public court hearing tomorrow morning. We do not want your struggles aired out for the world to see. We want to protect you. We have always just wanted to protect you. I stared down at the thick stack of papers. By legally declaring me incompetent and locking me away. Patricia shook her head rapidly, forcing a singular perfect tear to brim in the corner of her eye. By getting you the severe psychiatric help you refuse to seek for yourself. Audrey, you have to look around and admit that you cannot manage life alone anymore. You lost your marketing job. You have absolutely no money to your name. Your behavior has been completely erratic and frightening. We are offering you a lifeline today. She tapped the documents with a manicured fingernail. Just sign the consent forms right here. Let us take over the burden. Jamal has graciously agreed to step up and manage the $5 million from your grandfather's trust fund. He knows exactly how to invest it properly to ensure it grows and protects your future. I let out a harsh, dry laugh, letting my shoulders slump in mock defeat. Jamal wants to manage my money. How incredibly selfless and generous of him. He is a recognized financial expert. Patricia insisted, her soft tone hardening for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. He knows exactly what he is doing in the markets, and in return for your cooperation, we will make sure you are totally taken care of. Your father and I have discussed it thoroughly, and we are prepared to give you a very generous $500 monthly allowance. We will pay the rent on this apartment directly to your landlord, and you will have cash for groceries and basic necessities. You will never have to worry about surviving again. $500 a month. Out of a $5 million inheritance. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their greed was staggering. I leaned forward, ensuring my voice was perfectly clear, and directed toward the hidden microphone beneath the cushions. I needed to guide her directly into the trap. Let me get this straight, I said, keeping my tone carefully measured and entirely calm. Jamal is facing a massive federal audit at his firm tomorrow morning. I know all about Vanguard Horizon Group and the millions of dollars he lost. So the plan is to declare me insane today, seize my grandfather's trust fund, and use my money to save Jamal from going to federal prison. Patricia instantly stiffened. Her spine went entirely rigid, and the weeping mother facade shattered into a million pieces, revealing the cold, calculating woman lurking beneath. She clearly had no idea how I knew about Jamal's impending financial audit, but she quickly dismissed my accurate knowledge as the paranoid, obsessive ramblings of the unstable daughter she was so desperately trying to paint me as. You have absolutely no idea how the real corporate world works, Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes in blatant disgust. Jamal is a highly respected vice president. He is facing a minor liquidity issue, a temporary market fluctuation that your grandfather's idle wasted money can easily bridge. It is a strategic family investment, but you would rather hoard that wealth while living in this disgusting rat trap and bringing shame to our name. It is massive fraud, Mom, I stated plainly, keeping my eyes locked on hers. You are committing perjury, filing fake medical reports, and attempting to steal my inheritance just to cover up his blatant embezzlement. Patricia stood up abruptly, abandoning the performance entirely. She smoothed her expensive coat, glaring down at me with unvarnished, toxic contempt. Fraud is a very strong word for people who hold all the power in this city. We are respected, elite members of the community, Audrey. We sit on hospital charity boards. Your father plays golf with the very judges who oversee these specific cases. The truth will always come out, I said, playing the part of the cornered, defeated victim one last time. I will stand up and tell the judge exactly what you and Jamal are doing. Patricia let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the small, empty room. She stepped closer, towering over me, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. And who do you think the judge will believe? A jobless, unstable dropout living in a slum, or a prestigious, wealthy family, just trying to save their deeply troubled daughter? You have no money, no lawyer, and absolutely no credibility. You are nothing, Audrey. Sign the papers tonight, or we will have you forcibly committed by noon tomorrow. She turned on her heel and marched directly out of the apartment, slamming the flimsy wooden door so hard the walls shook. I sat perfectly still in the dim light for 10 full seconds, listening to the fading click of her expensive heels echoing down the hallway. Once I was absolutely certain she was gone, I reached under the sofa cushion and retrieved the digital recorder. A steadily blinking green light confirmed that every single word had been captured in pristine, high-definition audio. I hit the save button securely. Patricia had walked in hoping to secure my final surrender. Instead, wrapped tightly in her own arrogant certainty, she had just handed me the final piece of admissible audio evidence required to destroy them all. The morning sun cut through the heavy glass doors of the county courthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floors. I stood quietly near the entrance of courtroom 4B, leaning against the cold stone wall, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the people who shared my blood, but completely lacked my loyalty. I had deliberately traded the pathetic thrift store props from the night before for my actual wardrobe, though I kept my appearance strictly understated. I wore a tailored charcoal cashmere blazer, black wool trousers, and simple leather loafers. It was a masterclass in stealth wealth. There were no screaming designer logos, just impeccable Italian craftsmanship that spoke volumes to anyone who actually understood real money. My family unfortunately only understood the cheap illusion of it. Right on schedule, the heavy brass doors at the far end of the corridor swung violently open. My family made their grand entrance, moving down the hallway as if they were arriving at a royal coronation rather than a fraudulent conservatorship hearing. Richard walked in front, his chin held high, wearing a bespoke navy suit that he probably spent an hour selecting just to project absolute patriarchal authority. Patricia floated right beside him, her face arranged into a mask of brave, tragic suffering, clutching a pristine, cream-colored Chanel handbag like a protective shield. Melanie trailed slightly behind them, scrolling furiously on her phone, looking profoundly annoyed that her morning tennis match had been interrupted by my existence. And then there was Jamal. He walked with a distinct aggressive swagger, a cheap paper coffee cup clutched in his left hand. He wore a loud, pinstriped suit that screamed utter desperation, the exact kind of outfit a man wears when he desperately wants the world to believe he is a heavy hitter on Wall Street. He looked entirely too pleased with himself, radiating the toxic, unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully stolen $5 million to save his own skin. He had not yet realized that his entire boutique brokerage firm had been swallowed whole the night before by my anonymous corporate entity. They spotted me immediately. Patricia's performative grief intensified. She placed a manicured hand over her mouth and leaned heavily against Richard's arm, shaking her head as if looking at a pathetic ghost. Richard's eyes narrowed into a glare of pure, unadulterated contempt. He gestured for Patricia and Melanie to proceed directly into the courtroom, silently directing Jamal to handle the final intimidation tactic in the hallway. Jamal broke away from the group and marched directly toward me. His eyes roamed over my plain charcoal blazer, his lips curling into a vicious sneer. He deliberately stepped into my personal space, invading my physical boundary, with the aggressive posture of a schoolyard bully. As he leaned in, he purposefully jerked his left hand forward, aggressively tilting his paper cup. A generous splash of lukewarm, cheap brown coffee vaulted out of the plastic lid, landing directly on the sleeve of my cashmere blazer. The dark liquid quickly soaked into the fine material, leaving a harsh, ugly stain. "Oh, my absolute apologies," Jamal said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. He did not step back. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale mints and underlying anxiety. The fake apology vanished, replaced instantly by a low, predatory whisper meant only for me. "Drink up, dropout. You look like you really need the caffeine this morning." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at the dark brown stain on my sleeve and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his arrogant gaze. "You should really enjoy that cheap coffee while you can still afford it, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. He let out a short, barking laugh, shaking his head. "You are completely delusional, Audrey. It is actually pathetic to watch. Do you really think acting tough is going to save you today? Patricia and Richard have the judge eating right out of the palm of their hands." David Thorne submitted the fake toxicology reports an hour ago. You are legally a documented severe narcotic addict. Jamal took another step forward, his chest almost brushing against mine, trying to physically force me to submit to his overwhelming presence. After today, I own your finances. I own your trust fund. I own you. By noon, you will be locked in a mandatory psychiatric ward, and I will be moving your grandfather's idle millions into a high-yield growth portfolio under my direct management. You are finished. I slowly raised my left arm, deliberately shaking off the remaining drops of spilled coffee from my wrist. As I did, the cuff of my blazer slid back, exposing the timepiece secured around my wrist. It was a platinum Patek Philippe Grand Complications. It possessed a sapphire crystal case, back a perpetual calendar, and a moon phase indicator. It was a masterpiece of horology, a quiet, breathtaking piece of machinery that currently retailed for roughly 3 times the absolute total value of Jamal's fully loaded, heavily leased BMW. Jamal's eyes flicked down to my wrist. I saw his brow furrow for a fraction of a second. He was a man obsessed with status symbols, but his knowledge was strictly limited to flashy, entry-level luxury. He looked at the intricate platinum dial, blinked, and then smirked, clearly dismissing it as a cheap knockoff I had bought at a flea market. His ignorance was truly a bottomless well. I casually tapped the crystal face of the watch with my index finger. You are remarkably confident for a man who is currently $3 million in debt, I said softly. Jamal froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sudden chalky pallor. His eyes widened, darting frantically around the empty corridor, as if checking for hidden microphones. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusation, to shout me down, but the words completely died in his throat. He was paralyzed by the sheer terror of hearing his deepest, darkest secret spoken aloud by the woman he thought he had already buried. I stepped to the side, cleanly breaking his physical perimeter, and moved toward the heavy brass doors of the courtroom. I paused just before grabbing the handle, glancing back over my shoulder at the petrified vice president of Vanguard Horizon Group. The market opens in exactly 10 minutes, Jamal, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity in the quiet hallway. I hope your portfolio is braced for impact. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 swung shut, sealing us inside the hushed, imposing chamber. The transition from the chaotic hallway to the sterile, wood-paneled arena of justice was abrupt and sobering. I bypassed the gallery entirely and walked straight to the respondent's table, pulling out the heavy wooden chair and taking my seat. I sat perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in front of me, the brown coffee stain on the sleeve of my cashmere blazer drying into a dark mark. I placed my digital tablet face down on the table, maintaining absolute, unwavering composure. Across the aisle at the petitioner's table, my family's highly compensated legal representation was already putting on a show. David Thorne was a man who clearly loved the sound of his own voice and the reflection of his own expensive suits. He was meticulously arranging a mountain of case files, color-coded folders, and glossy legal briefs. Behind him, sitting in the first row of the gallery, my parents arranged themselves into the perfect portrait of deeply concerned, heartbroken family members. Patricia held a lace handkerchief loosely in her pristine hands, her face carrying a look of manufactured devastation. Richard sat rigid beside her, projecting the reluctant but resolute father forced into a terrible position. A moment later, the courtroom doors creaked open. Jamal slipped inside, looking absolutely horrific. The arrogant swagger he had flaunted in the hallway was entirely gone. His face was the color of wet ash, and sweat beaded heavily across his forehead. He slumped into the gallery seat next to Melanie, his hands trembling violently as he stared blankly at his knees. He was completely oblivious to the legal theater about to unfold, because his mind was currently trapped in the catastrophic high-speed implosion of his own fraudulent empire. He had just checked his phone. The market had officially opened. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Ramirez, a stern, sharp-featured woman with a reputation for merciless efficiency. She took her seat at the elevated bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and peered down at the heavy docket. Case number 842, in the matter of the conservatorship of Audrey Wilson. Judge Ramirez stated, her voice echoing clearly through the microphone. I see the petitioners are present with counsel. She shifted her gaze across the aisle, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked at my empty table. Is the respondent proceeding without legal representation today? I am representing myself, Your Honor, I replied clearly, my voice steady and unwavering. Judge Ramirez frowned, clearly displeased by this choice, but she nodded her head. Very well. Mr. Thorne, you represent the parents. You may proceed with your opening arguments regarding the petition for a permanent conservatorship. David Thorne stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced theatrical flourish. He stepped out from behind his table, moving toward the center of the room so he could command the absolute attention of the judge. He was a predator in a custom-tailored suit, entirely confident that he was dealing with helpless, uneducated prey. Thank you, Your Honor. Thorne began, his voice dripping with a sickly, rehearsed sympathy. We are here today under the most tragic of circumstances. You see behind me a family that has been pushed to the absolute breaking point. Richard and Patricia Wilson are upstanding, respected members of this community. For years, they have watched their daughter Audrey spiral into a dark, destructive abyss of severe substance abuse and extreme mental instability. They have tried everything to help her. They have offered resources, they have offered shelter, and they have offered their unconditional love. But tragically, those offers have been violently rejected by a young woman who is no longer capable of recognizing reality. Thorne paced slowly in front of the bench, shaking his head sorrowfully. Audrey Wilson was recently terminated from her minimum wage employment due to erratic, highly aggressive behavior. Thorne continued, weaving the exact lies my family had constructed. She currently resides in a substandard, unsafe apartment environment. Furthermore, she is the designated beneficiary of a substantial trust fund established by her late grandfather. A $5 million estate that is slated to disperse next month. Your Honor, if those funds are released to a woman in the active grips of severe narcotic addiction, it will not be a financial blessing. It will be a definitive death sentence. We are petitioning for a permanent conservatorship, so her brother-in-law, a licensed financial executive, can secure the assets, and her parents can force her into a mandatory long-term psychiatric rehabilitation facility. Judge Ramirez looked down at her notes, her expression remaining entirely neutral. Those are incredibly severe allegations, Mr. Thorne. Conservatorship is a profound restriction of personal liberty. You understand that the burden of proof rests entirely on the petitioners to demonstrate absolute medical incompetence. We understand the gravity of the request perfectly, Your Honor, Thorne said, a triumphant smirk flashing across his face. And we are prepared to meet that burden beyond a shadow of a doubt. Thorne walked back to his table and hoisted a massive 5-inch thick black binder into his arms. He carried it to the bench and placed it in front of the judge with a heavy, resounding thud. Inside this binder, you will find sworn affidavits from her family members detailing her aggressive outbursts, Thorne stated confidently. You will find financial records demonstrating her complete lack of fiscal responsibility. But the most critical piece of evidence, the absolute undeniable proof of her incompetence, is located under tab section 4. He paused for dramatic effect, turning slowly to look at me with an expression of sheer pity. We utilized a private investigative firm to secure a biological sample from Miss Wilson's residence last week, Thorne announced to the court, his voice booming with arrogant authority. We submitted that sample to the most rigorous, highly respected medical diagnostic facility in the state. I present to the court a verified comprehensive toxicology report bearing Audrey Wilson's name, pulled directly from Apex Tox Labs. The results are entirely conclusive. The screen shows catastrophic levels of amphetamines and synthetic opioids currently active in her system. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the wooden table. A cold electric thrill shot straight down my spine. The absolute, unmitigated audacity of their deception was almost beautiful. David Thorne was standing in a court of law, forcefully submitting a forged medical document to strip away my basic human rights. But he had not just chosen any random laboratory to validate his fabricated lie. He had specifically chosen Apex Tox Labs. He had chosen the flagship medical diagnostic facility of my own anonymous corporate empire. They had actually forged a document from the company that I legally owned and operated. It was the ultimate fatal error. They had handed me the very sword I would use to sever their heads. Thorne strutted back to his table looking like a man who had just won a marathon. He sat down, shooting a knowing, victorious glance toward the gallery. Behind him, Patricia leaned close to Richard's shoulder, her eyes fixed on my solitary figure sitting quietly at the defense table. She could not even afford a public defender. Patricia whispered, her voice a low, malicious hiss that barely carried across the quiet room. She is completely finished. The echo of Patricia's venomous whisper barely had time to fade before David Thorne spun back toward the center of the courtroom. He smoothed his lapels, looking incredibly satisfied with the devastating narrative he had laid out for the court. Now it was time for the emotional anchor of their grand performance. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice dropping into a solemn register. "Documents and toxicology reports paint a grim clinical picture, but they cannot truly convey the profound human tragedy at the center of this petition. To understand the absolute necessity of this conservatorship, the court must hear from the people who have carried this agonizing burden for over a decade. I call Patricia Wilson to the stand." Patricia stood up slowly from the front row of the gallery. Her performance began the exact second she left her seat. She moved with a fragile, unsteady grace, a woman entirely weighed down by the heavy burden of a broken child. She kept her eyes downcast, clutching her handbag against her chest, as if it were a physical shield. Richard reached out, offering a supportive squeeze to her hand before she stepped past him. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching her every movement with detached precision. Patricia approached the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth with a voice that trembled flawlessly on cue. She sat down carefully, adjusting her tailored coat, and pulled a pristine white tissue from her pocket, holding it loosely in her lap. "Mrs. Wilson," Thorne began, "I know this is incredibly difficult for a mother. Can you please describe for the court what the last 13 years have been like for your family?" Patricia took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked up, directing her gaze straight at Judge Ramirez, entirely bypassing me. "It has been a living nightmare." "Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking with the precise amount of emotional distress. "We have watched our bright, capable daughter completely throw her entire life away. She dropped out of university 13 years ago, and since that day, she has achieved absolutely nothing. She has refused every offer of help. She disappears for months at a time, only to resurface when she needs money. We have lived in constant terror, waiting for the phone call telling us she is dead." Thorne nodded sympathetically. 13 years of stagnation, Mrs. Wilson. Has Audrey maintained any form of steady employment during this time?" Patricia shook her head, dabbing away a single manufactured tear. "No. She takes minimum wage positions because of her erratic behavior and severe substance abuse. She isolates herself in terrible, dangerous living conditions. It breaks my heart to see how she chooses to live when we have a beautiful, safe home ready for her." "And what happens when you attempt to intervene?" Thorne prompted gently. "She becomes incredibly hostile." Patricia wept, her voice rising in a carefully calibrated crescendo of maternal desperation. "Just last night, I went to her apartment to beg her to seek voluntary treatment. I pleaded with her. But she was completely delusional, living in squalor, accusing her brother-in-law of ridiculous financial crimes. She is entirely detached from reality. We cannot reason with her anymore. I listened to her weave the events of the previous night into her web of lies, maintaining my expressionless facade. She was a master manipulator, twisting my factual statements about Jamal into evidence of my supposed insanity." Thorne leaned against the wooden rail of the jury box. "Mrs. Wilson, some might argue that a 33-year-old woman has the right to live as she chooses, even if those choices are destructive. Why are you and your husband petitioning the court to strip her of her autonomy today?" Patricia looked directly at Judge Ramirez, her hands gripping the wooden ledge of the witness box. Her tears flowed freely now, an Oscar-worthy display of maternal anguish. "Because we are out of time, Your Honor," she sobbed, her voice echoing with raw, desperate pleading. Her grandfather left her a substantial trust fund that is scheduled to disperse in a matter of weeks. If she gets access to that money, she will not use it to build a life. She will use it to fund her addiction. She will end up dead in an alleyway, and her father and I will have to bury our child. We do not want to control her. We do not want to restrict her. We just want to protect her from herself. We are begging this court to give us the legal authority to save our daughter's life before it is too late. Patricia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed sobs. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the sound of a weeping mother begging to save her child. It was a flawless, devastating performance. Thorne let the heavy emotional silence stretch for several seconds, ensuring the impact of her words settled firmly over the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Thorne said softly. "I have no further questions." He turned back to the petitioner's table, shooting me a look of absolute victory. I was nothing but a failure, a dangerous addict, a violent burden on a loving family. He sat back down and closed his massive black binder with a loud, authoritative thud. Judge Ramirez sat perfectly still at the elevated bench. She looked at Patricia, then down at the heavy stack of forged medical documents and sworn affidavits sitting on her desk. The entire room waited for the inevitable ruling, expecting my freedom to be revoked. Slowly, Judge Ramirez reached up and adjusted her reading glasses. She shifted her sharp, piercing gaze across the quiet courtroom, completely bypassing the weeping mother and the triumphant lawyer, and locked her eyes directly onto me, sitting alone at the defense table. "Does the respondent have absolutely anything else to say to me before I formally review these final lab results?" "I have nothing to add at this exact moment, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the quiet courtroom. "I believe the documents submitted by opposing counsel will speak entirely for themselves. I welcome your thorough review of the laboratory results." David Thorne scoffed loudly, stepping forward before the judge could even reach for the sealed envelope. His aggressive instinct to dominate the room completely overrode basic courtroom decorum. He leaned heavily against the podium, projecting the urgent energy of a man trying to defuse a ticking time bomb. "Your Honor, while you review the toxicology report, I must aggressively press our motion for an immediate emergency injunction," Thorne stated, raising his voice to ensure it reached every corner of the room. "The trust fund disperses on Monday. We are asking for a temporary financial conservatorship to be enacted before the close of business today. My clients humbly request that full fiduciary control of the $5 million estate be immediately transferred to Vanguard Horizon Group under the direct management of Jamal Pierce." Thorne gestured grandly toward the gallery. "Mr. Pierce is a highly respected vice president at Vanguard. He possesses the pristine financial acumen necessary to protect these assets from being squandered on narcotics. If the court delays this ruling, the respondent will have unmitigated access to $5 million by Monday morning. She will drain those accounts within 48 hours. We simply cannot afford a standard legal delay. The transfer of management to Mr. Pierce must be executed right now." I slowly turned my head toward the gallery to observe the man Thorne was endorsing. Jamal was currently slumped in his seat, looking as though he might physically vomit on the polished hardwood floor. He was staring at his phone with wide, bloodshot eyes. He did not look like a respected financial executive ready to manage a massive estate. He looked like a man who had just realized his entire boutique brokerage firm had been legally liquidated and absorbed into a holding company, leaving him millions of dollars in debt. Thorne was completely oblivious to his star witness's psychological collapse. Judge Ramirez held up a single authoritative hand, instantly silencing the ambitious lawyer. "You will contain your urgency, Mr. Thorne. I will not be rushed into a permanent restriction of rights, nor will I mandate an emergency financial transfer without fully examining the primary evidence. You have submitted a certified toxicology report from Apex Tox Labs. I'm going to review it now." Thorne nodded respectfully, taking a step back and buttoning his suit jacket. "Of course, Your Honor. The results are entirely conclusive." Judge Ramirez picked up the thick manila envelope bearing the official red seal of the laboratory. She slid a silver letter opener beneath the flap and sliced it open with a sharp, tearing sound that echoed loudly in the silent room. She extracted the glossy multi-page report and smoothed it flat on her desk. The courtroom held its collective breath. Patricia sniffled quietly into her lace tissue, perfectly maintaining her tragic maternal posture. Richard sat rigidly beside her, his chin held high in patriarchal defiance, eager to witness my total destruction. Judge Ramirez adjusted her glasses. She looked at the first page. Her expression was completely unreadable, a blank slate of absolute judicial neutrality. She flipped to the second page. Her eyes scanned the dense columns of medical data, the chemical breakdowns, and the physician's signatures. She flipped to the third page. Then her steady reading rhythm abruptly stopped for a moment. Her hands went entirely still, her brow furrowed, creating a deep, pronounced crease above her glasses. She stared intently at a specific section of the document, her eyes narrowing as she carefully reread a particular line. The absolute neutrality of her judicial demeanor began to crack, replaced by a rapidly growing expression of profound confusion. She lowered the document slightly, looking across the courtroom directly at David Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Ramirez said, her voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register that commanded absolute silence. "You stated that your investigative team personally secured this biological sample from the respondent's residence last week." "That is absolutely correct, Your Honor," Thorne replied confidently, flashing his brilliant practiced smile once again. Chain of custody was strictly maintained from the moment of collection directly to the intake desk at Apex Tox Labs. There is zero margin for error or contamination. Judge Ramirez did not smile back. She looked down at the document again, her lips pressing together into a thin, tight line. She flipped back to the first page, her eyes locking onto the official corporate letterhead of the laboratory. The bold blue emblem of Apex Tox Labs sat prominently at the top of the page. She stared at it for a long, heavy moment. Without saying another word, Judge Ramirez set the laboratory report down on her bench. She reached to her left, pulling over a completely separate, thick file folder. It was not a document submitted by my family. It was a comprehensive background check file clearly marked with the seal of the court's independent investigative unit. In high-stakes conservatorship cases involving multi-million-dollar estates, judges routinely ordered independent financial background checks on all parties involved to verify assets and uncover potential conflicts of interest. She opened the background file. She looked at the first page, flipped past several dense sheets of financial data, and stopped. Her eyes darted rapidly between the official laboratory report submitted by David Thorne and the independent financial background check generated by the court. The silence in the courtroom transformed from dramatic anticipation into a suffocating, heavy tension. Thorne's confident smile began to waver slightly. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. In the gallery, Patricia lowered her handkerchief, her tears forgotten. Judge Ramirez looked at the letterhead on the drug test, then looked at the separate background check file she ordered on me. A tense silence fills the room. The silence stretched over the courtroom, humming with tension. Judge Ramirez stared at the two conflicting documents on her desk, her eyes darting between the Apex Tox Labs report and the financial background check. The stillness was unnatural following Thorne's aggressive rhetoric and my mother's theatrical sobbing. Patricia was entirely unaccustomed to not being the center of attention. She had delivered her flawless performance and expected an immediate sympathetic response. The judge's prolonged silence was an unbearable insult to her orchestrated tragedy. Sensing the narrative slipping, Patricia's grieving mother facade violently fractured. She gripped the wooden rail and leaned forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "She is a drug addict!" my mother roared, her voice shattering the quiet with violent, echoing force. "Look at her sitting there. She is a dangerous, delusional addict, and she will destroy everything if you do not lock her away today." The outburst completely stripped away her tragic elegance. Richard winced, grabbing her arm desperately, trying to pull her back into her seat. Jamal flinched violently, snapping up from his phone. Even Thorne looked horrified, spinning around to shoot her a silencing glare. Judge Ramirez did not flinch. She slowly raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp cracking impact that commanded immediate obedience. "You will restrain yourself immediately, Mrs. Wilson," Judge Ramirez ordered, her voice cutting through the air like a steel blade. "This is a court of law, not a theater for your emotional outbursts. One more disruption, and I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom." Patricia sank back into her seat, her chest heaving heavily as she glared at me with absolute, unadulterated hatred. I did not react. I remained perfectly composed, sitting straight in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the wooden table. I did not offer a defensive response. I did not rise to the bait. I simply let the echoes of her desperate, venomous scream hang in the air, allowing the judge to witness the exact reality of my mother's toxic nature. Judge Ramirez shifted her intense gaze from Patricia back to the documents on her desk. She closed the independent background file, resting her hands flat on top of the manila folder. The profound confusion that had clouded her face just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the elevated bench, and looked directly at the woman who had just screamed across her courtroom. "Mrs. Wilson, since you feel so compelled to address this court directly," Judge Ramirez said, her tone dangerously calm, "let me ask you a very simple question about the daughter you claim to be desperately trying to save. Are you sure you know what she does for a living?" Patricia blinked momentarily, thrown off balance by the unexpected question. She glanced nervously at Thorne, who was gripping the edges of his podium, a sudden panicked sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. She does not do anything," Patricia stammered, her voice losing its aggressive edge. "I just told you, Your Honor, she works meaningless minimum wage jobs when she is not completely incapacitated. She is a failure. She dropped out of college and ruined her life." "I see," Judge Ramirez replied evenly. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the background check file. "Because the independent financial investigation mandated by this court paints a drastically different picture. According to verified federal tax records and corporate registries, your daughter is the sole proprietary owner of a highly diversified portfolio of healthcare and medical technology companies." The air completely evaporated from the quiet courtroom. "Your Honor, I must formally object to the relevance of—" Thorne began, his voice cracking slightly as pure panic finally overrode his arrogance. "Overruled, Mr. Thorne. Do not interrupt me." Judge Ramirez snapped, her eyes never leaving my parents. "This background check confirms that Audrey Wilson is not a minimum wage employee. She is the founder and chief executive officer of an anonymous holding entity that controls multiple successful diagnostic laboratories across 3 different states. Her verified personal net worth, entirely independent of any pending trust fund distributions, currently exceeds $40 million. A suffocating gasp ripped through the gallery. Melanie dropped her phone, the device clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. Jamal buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic groan as the final pieces of his absolute destruction fell into place. Patricia stared at the judge, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The blood drained completely from Richard's face, leaving him a chalky, sickly pale. His carefully constructed posture of patriarchal authority shattered instantly. He looked at me, then back to the judge, his mind desperately struggling to compute the impossible mathematical reality being presented to him. "Wait, no," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a genuine, terrifying realization. "That is absolutely impossible. She is a dropout. She has nothing." "The federal government disagrees with your assessment, Mr. Wilson," Judge Ramirez stated coldly. "The court's independent investigators spent the last 72 hours tracing a complex web of corporate LLCs directly back to the respondent sitting quietly at that table." Judge Ramirez turned her attention away from my petrified parents and focused her piercing gaze entirely on David Thorne. The high-priced lawyer looked as though the floor beneath his polished Italian shoes was actively collapsing. She slowly picked up the forged, glossy laboratory report that Thorne had so triumphantly submitted just minutes earlier. She held the document up in the air, her fingers pinching the top corner so the bold blue corporate logo was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "Which brings me to this incredibly fascinating piece of evidence," Judge Ramirez said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. Mr. Thorne, you submitted a lab result from Apex Tox Labs. Did you happen to verify who owns this laboratory? The heavy silence in the courtroom felt almost tactile. David Thorne stood frozen at his podium, his mouth slightly open, his mind completely failing to process the judge's question. He looked at the glossy laboratory report in Judge Ramirez's hand, then glanced back at my parents, searching for an answer they could not possibly provide. The arrogance that had defined his entire career was rapidly dissolving into naked panic. He had relied entirely on my family's assessment of me as a pathetic, helpless addict. He had not done his own due diligence. I decided that the charade had gone on long enough. I pushed back my heavy wooden chair and stood up. The scraping sound echoed loudly across the polished floors, drawing every eye in the room directly to me. I did not slouch. I did not cower. I stood at my full height, squaring my shoulders and projecting the absolute, unwavering authority of a woman who controlled a $40 million medical diagnostic empire. The false persona of the broken, helpless daughter vanished instantly, replaced by the calculating executive who had systematically dismantled their entire scheme. I reached down to my table and picked up the sleek leather portfolio I had brought with me. I unzipped the top and extracted a thick stack of certified legal documents, along with my platinum-engraved corporate identification card. I bypassed my designated defense table and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. My footsteps were slow, measured, and completely devoid of fear. I approached the elevated bench, stopping right beside David Thorne, who instinctively took a step back as if I had suddenly caught fire. Your Honor, I can answer that question for Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. I extended my hand, offering the stack of certified documents directly to Judge Ramirez. I am Audrey Reynolds. I operate professionally under my grandmother's maiden name to separate my corporate ventures from my family's toxic public legacy. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Tox Labs. The facility that supposedly processed this drug test belongs entirely to me. Judge Ramirez accepted the documents from my hand. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the official articles of incorporation, the state registry files, and the verified federal tax documents that unequivocally proved my ownership. She picked up my corporate identification card, comparing the glossy photograph to my face, and then looked down at the forged drug tests Thorne had submitted. This is a fascinating development, Judge Ramirez stated, her voice dangerously calm. Mr. Thorne, it appears your private investigative team has accomplished the impossible. They have somehow managed to secure a drug test from the respondent's own flagship laboratory without the respondent's knowledge, and then completely bypassed her own internal security protocols to falsify a positive result. Thorne looked like he was about to pass out. He gripped the edges of his podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze emerged. He looked back at Richard and Patricia, his eyes wide with furious accusation. My parents had assured him this would be an easy, uncontested conservatorship. They had guaranteed him that I was entirely incapable of defending myself. Instead, they had just manipulated him into committing a severe career-ending felony by submitting forged medical evidence directly to a superior court judge. Your Honor, I must interject, Thorne finally stammered, his voice shaking violently. My firm hired a third-party contractor to secure that document. We acted completely in good faith based on the information provided by the petitioners. We had absolutely no idea the respondent was affiliated with that corporate entity. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense for submitting fraudulent documents to this court, Mr. Thorne, Judge Ramirez countered sharply. I turned slightly, addressing the judge while keeping my family entirely in my peripheral vision. Your Honor, I can specifically identify the exact flaws in that forgery. If you look at the bottom right corner of the document, you will see a digital signature block. Apex Tox Labs transitioned to a fully encrypted blockchain-verified digital stamping system over 18 months ago. The document Mr. Thorne submitted utilizes our obsolete legacy formatting. Furthermore, the attending physician listed on that report, Dr. Eris Thorne retired from my company 3 years ago. The perpetrators of this fraud simply downloaded an outdated template from an old public filing and altered the patient data. Judge Ramirez flipped to the second page of the forged report, her eyes narrowing as she verified my claims. She nodded slowly, placing the document flat on her desk, with a heavy sigh of absolute disgust. "The court notes your observations, Ms. Reynolds," Judge Ramirez said, using my corporate name with deliberate respect. "The evidence of forgery is overwhelming." I stood tall, the culmination of a decade of silent, relentless work, finally coming to light. For 13 years, I had allowed my family to believe their own vicious lies. I had let them mock my choices, belittle my lifestyle, and dismiss my ambitions. I had used their boundless arrogance as camouflage, building my wealth and power entirely in the shadows while they squandered their energy trying to control me. They had demanded a failure, so I had given them the illusion of one perfectly masking the empire I was constructing right beneath their noses. The air in the courtroom felt charged, practically vibrating with the catastrophic collapse of my family's grand design. They had walked into this room expecting to strip away my freedom, seize my grandfather's $5 million trust fund, and lock me in a psychiatric ward. Instead, they were watching their own fraudulent schemes detonate in spectacular fashion. Patricia let out a loud, high-pitched gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the reality of my wealth and power finally registered in her mind. Jamal, sitting directly behind her, lost his grip entirely. He dropped his phone. The heavy device slammed against the wooden floorboards with a sharp cracking sound that echoed through the stunned silence. I slowly turned away from the judge's bench and faced my family, offering them a lethal, terrifying smile. Thorne gripped the edges of his podium so hard his knuckles were stark white. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to easily steamroll a broken woman. Instead, he had just handed forged medical documents directly to the chief executive officer of the very laboratory he was attempting to impersonate. I slowly turned from my petrified family and stepped closer to Thorne. He immediately recoiled, his false professional bravado stripped away. "Let us take a much closer look at this conclusive evidence you have presented, Mr. Thorne," I said with authoritative precision. "You claim your team maintained a strict chain of custody. You claim this document represents an unassailable medical truth. Yet a basic visual inspection reveals catastrophic inconsistencies that any entry-level intern at my company would immediately flag." I gestured toward this document on Judge Ramirez's bench. "The corporate letterhead is completely wrong. The logo printed at the top of that page features a blue and gray double helix motif. Apex Tox Labs completely rebranded 3 years ago. Our current logo is a minimalist silver crest. The blue and gray design has not been utilized on official company documentation in over 36 months. Whoever manufactured this document simply ran an internet search, grabbed the first image they found on an outdated directory, and slapped it onto a standard word processing template." Thorne opened his mouth, but no words materialized. He looked frantically toward the gallery, seeking rescue from the clients who had just destroyed his career. Richard and Patricia remained frozen in their seats, paralyzed by the magnitude of their exposure. Jamal looked physically ill, his head hanging between his knees. Furthermore, I continued pacing slowly in front of the defense table. "I direct your attention to the specific testing methodology listed in paragraph 2 of your fraudulent submission. The document cites the use of the Reynolds Rapid Screen Protocol for identifying synthetic narcotics. It is a highly specialized proprietary testing matrix utilized exclusively by top-tier medical facilities." I stopped pacing and locked eyes directly with Thorne. The absolute terror in his gaze was deeply satisfying. The predator had realized he was the prey. "Do you know why it is called the Reynolds Rapid Screen Protocol, Mr. Thorne?" I asked, lowering my voice to a lethal intensity. "Because I invented it. I personally spent 4 years in the laboratory developing that exact chemical sequencing process. I hold the exclusive international patents for that methodology. It is legally registered under my name, Audrey Reynolds. You did not just forge a random drug test. You forged a drug test using a proprietary scientific method that I personally created, and you printed it on the letterhead of a company that I entirely own. The courtroom remained completely silent. The sheer scale of the blunder was truly staggering. Thorne had essentially walked into a courtroom and tried to sell a stolen car directly back to the original manufacturer. The devastating irony of their scheme was absolute. They had tried to paint me as an incompetent addict using the very instruments of my professional success. Your Honor! Thorne gasped, his voice cracking into a high, desperate squeak. He was sweating profusely, the moisture glistening on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Your Honor, I must respectfully request permission to immediately withdraw this document from the official court record. My firm was clearly misled by third-party investigators. We had absolutely no knowledge of these discrepancies. We withdraw the motion for emergency conservatorship entirely. He reached a shaking hand toward the bench, a frantic, instinctual attempt to snatch the glossy paper back and somehow erase the felony he had just committed in broad daylight. He wanted to make the evidence disappear to salvage whatever was left of his pristine legal reputation before it burned to ash. Judge Ramirez moved faster. She slammed her hand down flat over the forged document, pinning it firmly to the mahogany wood. Her dark eyes blazed with righteous judicial fury. "You will not touch this document, Mr. Thorne," Judge Ramirez commanded, her voice echoing with the force of a thunderclap. "You do not get to submit fraudulent medical records to this court attempt to strip a citizen of her fundamental legal rights and then simply withdraw the evidence when you are caught in a lie." Thorne froze, his hand suspended in midair, trembling violently. He slowly lowered his arm, stepping back from the podium as if the wood itself had burned him. "This court operates on the assumption of factual integrity." Judge Ramirez continued, her gaze shifting to include Richard and Patricia, who were now shrinking into their seats, desperate to escape her wrath. "The submission of fabricated evidence is a direct assault on the judicial process. I am officially denying your motion to withdraw this submission." She picked up the forged laboratory report, holding it tightly in her hand. The air crackled with the weight of her impending decree. "I am officially impounding this document as material evidence of criminal fraud," Judge Ramirez declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "I will be transferring this file along with the complete transcript of today's proceedings directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation." The echo of my smile barely registered before my family's facade shattered. Judge Ramirez impounding the forged document acted as a physical blow. David Thorne shrank back, his pristine legal career incinerated. But Jamal finally broke. The pressure of impending financial ruin, compounded by the realization that he had committed perjury against a woman holding vastly more power than he could comprehend, snapped his mind in half. His polished exterior dissolved, revealing the panicked fraud underneath. He scrambled to his feet. The heavy chair behind him toppled over, crashing violently onto the floorboards. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "She's lying. Even if she is the CEO, she's mentally unstable. She stole money from this family," Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with raw panic. Judge Ramirez reached for her gavel. Her eyes flashed with intense judicial fury. The bailiff placed his hand on his utility belt and took 2 rapid steps forward, ready to physically subdue the screaming man. I did not need the bailiff. I turned my body, slowly pivoting my attack away from the disgraced lawyer and focusing the full, devastating weight of my attention entirely onto my brother-in-law. I raised my right hand, a simple gesture that stalled the bailiff in his tracks. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 3 agonizing seconds, forcing Jamal to hear his own ragged breathing. "I strongly suggest you lower your voice and choose your next words with absolute precision, Jamal," I stated, my tone chillingly calm. "Because your current legal exposure is about to multiply exponentially." I turned back to my leather portfolio. While my family assumed I was destitute, I had spent the last decade acquiring the assets of men exactly like Jamal. I extracted a secondary red folder. I held it up, letting the harsh lights catch the embossed gold logo of Vanguard Horizon Group. Jamal stopped breathing. His eyes locked onto the red folder. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His pointing hand slowly dropped to his side. "You want to speak about stealing?" I said, walking toward the center of the room. "I find that topic incredibly timely. Your Honor, my brother-in-law is a vice president at Vanguard Horizon Group. My family believes his position grants him the pristine financial authority required to seize my grandfather's trust fund." What Jamal failed to mention to this court and to his own family is that Vanguard Horizon Group has been hemorrhaging capital for 18 months. I continued, my voice echoing clearly. They were desperate for a bailout. They sought a buyer to liquidate assets and absorb liabilities. I looked directly into Jamal's terrified eyes. "Speaking of stealing, yesterday at 4 p.m. my parent company acquired your investment firm, Jamal. During the due diligence audit last night, we found $3 million missing from your client's accounts." Jamal let out a pathetic gasp. His knees visibly buckled and he had to grab the wooden railing to keep himself from collapsing. Patricia stared at him, her face frozen in absolute horror. She was incapable of comprehending how the man she championed as the family savior was currently dissolving into a puddle of terror. When you acquire a financial institution, standard corporate procedure dictates an immediate due diligence audit. I explained, keeping my eyes locked on the trembling man. I deployed a team of forensic accountants to review the internal ledgers last night. They worked until dawn. I pulled a sheet of paper from the red folder. It was a highlighted financial ledger covered in red ink. I held it up for the judge to see before turning it toward the gallery. $3 million systematically siphoned off over 2 years, routed through offshore shell companies, and deposited into private accounts controlled exclusively by Jamal Pierce. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps. The bailiff instinctively stepped closer to the gallery. Judge Ramirez leaned forward, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. "You are a thief, Jamal," I said. "You orchestrated this entire conservatorship petition because you knew your firm was being audited. You desperately needed access to my grandfather's $5 million trust fund by Monday morning to replace the money you stole. You intended to drain my inheritance to cover your tracks before the federal investigators arrived at your office." Jamal was shaking uncontrollably. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a lie, searching for anything to save him from the crushing reality of federal prison. He found nothing. The doors were closed. The judge was glaring at him. I was not finished. The most devastating piece of this revelation was not meant for Jamal. It was meant for the people sitting next to him, the people who blindly enabled his arrogance while destroying my life. I slowly turned away from the broken vice president. I directed my gaze to the front row of the gallery, locking eyes directly with my father. Richard was sitting completely paralyzed, his mouth slightly open, the illusion of his patriarchal supremacy entirely shattered. Beside him, Patricia clutched her designer handbag like a life preserver, her eyes wide with sudden terror. They had trusted Jamal. They handed him complete control of their financial future because he wore the right suits and played golf at the right clubs. They valued the appearance of success over the reality of character. I offered them a slow, lethal smile, the kind of smile that promised absolute ruin. The forensic accountants did not just trace where the stolen money went, I stated, letting my words ring out with terrifying clarity. They also identified exactly which specific client portfolios were targeted. Jamal did not steal from random strangers. He targeted the accounts he personally managed, the accounts where he held unsupervised discretionary control. I took one final deliberate step forward, standing directly in front of my parents. "And guess whose retirement accounts Jamal drained to cover his tracks? Yours." The revelation hung in the courtroom air, a heavy, suffocating truth that paralyzed every single person in the gallery. I stood perfectly still, watching the exact moment my family's carefully curated reality fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. For one agonizing second, there was absolutely no sound. Then the illusion shattered. Melanie was the first to break. My perfect golden sister, the woman who had spent her entire life parading her flawless marriage and superior social standing, in my face slowly turned to look at her husband, Her impeccably manicured hands began to tremble. "Jamal," Melanie whispered, her voice tight and high-pitched. "Jamal, tell her she is lying. Tell her right now." Jamal could not even meet her eyes. He remained hunched over his hands, gripping his knees, his breath coming in short, panicked wheezes. The silence was his confession. The realization hit Melanie with the force of a physical blow. Her face twisted from perfectly applied confusion into pure, unadulterated rage. "You stole from my parents!" Melanie shrieked, her voice cracking the quiet courtroom. She lunged forward, her hands curling into fists. She slammed her hands against Jamal's chest, hitting him with a frantic, desperate energy. "You told me we were fine. You said the yacht, the Aspen house, the new cars. You said it was all from your bonuses. You made me a criminal by association." Jamal scrambled backward, tripping over the heavy wooden bench as he tried to shield his face from his wife's onslaught. "Melanie, stop, please, I can fix it," he begged, his voice pathetic and weak. "I just need a few days. I was going to use the trust to leverage a new position. I can put it all back." "Put it back with what?" Melanie screamed, striking his shoulder. "You are a felon, Jamal. You are going to federal prison. You have ruined my life." Her screams echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, a soundtrack to the absolute destruction of her pristine suburban fantasy. She had spent a decade treating me like a disease because my life did not match her country club standards, only to discover her entire existence was funded by federal wire fraud. While Melanie battered her disgraced husband, my father underwent a horrifying metamorphosis. Richard had always been a man composed of absolute certainty and financial arrogance. His entire identity rested on his ability to control his wealth and wield it as a weapon against his children. I watched him process the reality that his accounts, the multi-million-dollar retirement portfolios he gloated about at every Thanksgiving dinner, were completely empty. His face drained of all color, shifting from a pale gray to an alarming waxy white. His jaw dropped open, but no words came out. His hands, usually so steady and commanding, began to shake violently. He reached up his fingers, clawing desperately at the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, and then grabbed his chest. "My money," Richard gasped, his voice a ragged, hollow rasp. 35 years of building my firm, my investments. You drained everything." He stared at Jamal, the son-in-law he had championed, the man he had trusted to manage his entire fortune simply because Jamal knew how to order the right scotch and wear the right watch. My father had bypassed me, his own daughter dismissing my intelligence and work ethic because I did not fit his archaic patriarchal view of success. He had handed the keys to his kingdom to a charismatic fraud. Richard swayed heavily, his knees buckling. He grabbed the wooden gallery railing to keep from collapsing onto the floor. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The invincible patriarch was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man, staring into an abyss of absolute poverty. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, unspoken plea, but I offered nothing. I stood my ground, an unmovable wall, watching the consequences of his own arrogance crush him. As my father gasped for air and my sister continued to strike her husband, my mother completely unraveled. Patricia had always prioritized optics above all else. Her social standing, her pristine reputation among the Boston elite, her flawless facade, these were the things that fueled her existence. The terrifying realization that she was now entirely destitute, that her son-in-law was headed to federal prison, and that this entire humiliating spectacle was unfolding in a public courtroom shattered her mind. She threw her head back and unleashed a piercing, guttural wail. It was a sound devoid of any elegance, a raw, animalistic shriek of pure social terror. "My friends!" Patricia wailed, her hands tearing at her perfectly coiffed hair, ruining the expensive styling in seconds. "The country club! What are we going to tell everyone? We have nothing. We are ruined." She spun wildly, her eyes darting around the chaotic room before locking onto me. Her despair instantly morphed back into toxic, desperate venom. She lunged toward the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court. "This is your fault," Patricia screamed, her face contorted with rage, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You set this up. You hid your money from us while we suffered. You planned this to destroy our family." The courtroom descended into absolute pandemonium. Melanie was shoving Jamal against the heavy wooden benches, screaming about divorce and bankruptcy. Jamal was loudly weeping, begging anyone who would listen for a chance to explain. Richard was slumped over the railing, clutching his chest and gasping for oxygen. Patricia was thrashing against the dividing gate, screaming venomous accusations at me while her perfect life burned to the ground. The sharp, deafening crack of Judge Ramirez's wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block, cutting through the hysterical shrieks like a gunshot. She did not stop at a single strike. She hammered the heavy wood down repeatedly, her voice rising above the chaotic din with the absolute terrifying authority of a superior court judge who had just witnessed her courtroom turned into a criminal circus. "Order!" Judge Ramirez roared the command, vibrating against the polished mahogany walls. "I will have order in my courtroom this instant, or I will hold every single one of you in criminal contempt." Two uniformed bailiffs charged through the wooden gate separating the gallery from the well. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency. The first bailiff seized Melanie by the shoulders, physically peeling her off Jamal. My sister was a mess of smeared designer makeup and ruined hair. Her manicured fingers curled into claws as she continued to spit venom at her disgraced husband. The second bailiff hauled Jamal to his feet by the collar of his expensive ruined suit, shoving him back against the solid oak benches to prevent him from fleeing the room. Richard remained slumped over the wooden railing, his face a terrifying shade of gray, his hands clutching his chest as he took shallow, ragged breaths. The absolute certainty that had defined his entire existence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, destitute shell of a patriarch. Patricia crouched beside him, trembling violently. The pristine, untouchable Boston socialite was entirely gone. She looked small, terrified, and utterly exposed. I stood perfectly still in the center of the well, untouched by the hurricane of devastation swirling around me. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of executive calm. For 13 years I had endured their mockery, their dismissal, and their relentless psychological warfare. I had allowed them to cast me as the family failure, the pathetic addict, the scapegoat they needed to maintain their own fragile illusions of superiority. Now I watched the natural consequences of their own boundless arrogance tear them to shreds. The courtroom finally fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by Melanie's quiet sobbing and Richard's labored breathing. The air felt thick, charged with the catastrophic weight of what had just transpired. Judge Ramirez stood behind her elevated bench, her dark eyes scanning the ruined family before her. The expression on her face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at David Thorne, who was still paralyzed behind his podium, his legal career currently burning to the ground. Then she looked at my parents. "In my 22 years on the bench, I have presided over countless disputes," Judge Ramirez began, her voice dropping to a dangerously low lethal register that demanded absolute attention. "I have witnessed greed, malice, and familial betrayal in almost every conceivable form. But I have never in my entire career witnessed a conspiracy as brazen, as malicious, and as fundamentally arrogant as the one you have brought into my courtroom today." Patricia let out a pathetic whimper, shrinking behind Richard's slumped shoulder. The judge ignored her, her gaze pinning my father to the spot. "You walked into a court of law and attempted to strip a highly successful independent woman of her fundamental human rights." Judge Ramirez continued, her words landing like physical blows. "You sought to declare her legally incompetent not out of any genuine concern for her well-being, but out of a calculated predatory desire to seize her financial assets. You viewed the judicial system not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon to facilitate your own theft." Judge Ramirez picked up the forged toxicology report, holding it up by the corner as if it were a piece of rotting garbage. "And to achieve this vile objective, you did not merely lie. You manufactured evidence. You attempted to manipulate the court by submitting fraudulent medical documents, operating under the staggering delusion that your wealth and social status made you immune to basic scrutiny." She dropped the forged paper back onto her desk with a sharp slap. "The petition for emergency medical conservatorship over Audrey Reynolds is hereby dismissed," Judge Ramirez declared, her voice ringing with absolute unshakable finality. "And it is dismissed with prejudice. You are permanently barred from ever bringing this matter before a court in this jurisdiction again." Thorne closed his eyes, a shudder running through his rigid frame. He knew what was coming next. The dismissal of the petition was merely the administrative cleanup. The true punishment was about to begin. Judge Ramirez did not sit down. She leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the mahogany bench, her eyes narrowing as she locked her focus entirely onto Patricia Richard and their paralyzed attorney. "However, the dismissal of this petition does not conclude today's proceedings," Judge Ramirez stated, her tone turning ice cold. "This court will not simply turn a blind eye to the severe felonies committed within these walls. Ignorance is not a shield, and your social standing offers you absolutely no protection in my courtroom." She raised her hand, signaling directly to the armed bailiffs stationed in the gallery and the well. "I am ordering the immediate detainment of the petitioners Richard and Patricia Reynolds, along with their legal counsel, Mr. David Thorne." Judge Ramirez commanded, her words slicing through the heavy silence. "You are to be held pending formal charges by the district attorney for perjury, the submission of forged medical documents to a superior court, and attempted criminal fraud." Patricia let out a high-pitched shriek of terror. "No! You cannot do this! We are the Reynolds. We live in Beacon Hill." Her desperate, pathetic cry was immediately drowned out by the harsh metallic sound that followed. Click, click. The bailiffs simultaneously reached down to their utility belts. They unclipped their heavy steel handcuffs. The distinct, terrifying sound of the metal restraints being readied echoed sharply across the polished wooden floors. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around my father's wrists sounded like a vault door slamming shut on his entire existence. Richard Reynolds, a man who had built an empire on intimidation and demanded absolute obedience from everyone in his orbit, was violently jerked backward. The responding bailiff offered no deference to his custom suit or his country club pedigree. He was processed with the same rough, uncompromising physical force used on any common criminal. Richard gasped loudly, his chest heaving as the cold steel dug into his wrists, his eyes darting frantically around the sterile room. Seeing her husband completely subdued and shackled finally broke whatever fragile thread of sanity Patricia was still clinging to. The harsh reality of federal prison, of permanently losing her Beacon Hill mansion, her social status, and her freedom crashed over her all at once in a terrifying wave. She did not merely cry. She completely disintegrated. Her legs simply gave out beneath her weight. She collapsed onto the polished wooden floorboards of the courtroom, the fabric of her designer dress pooling around her trembling body. A bailiff reached down to grab her arm, but she thrashed wildly, fighting the restraint. She crawled forward on her hands and knees. It was a pathetic, truly horrifying display of weakness. This was the woman who had spent decades cultivating an impenetrable image of untouchable perfection. She had judged everyone around her, including me, with a ruthless disdain. Now she was dragging herself across a filthy courtroom floor, her pristine makeup running down her face in ugly streaks. She reached through the wooden gate, separating the well from the gallery, her manicured fingers clawing at the empty air, desperate to grab hold of my skirt as the bailiff hauled her back up to stand. "Audrey, please!" Patricia screamed, her voice tearing painfully at her throat, completely devoid of any previous sophistication. "Please, you cannot let them do this. We are your parents. We are blood. Tell the judge it was a misunderstanding. You have the money, Audrey. You have the lawyers. You can stop this right now. Do not let them take us away in handcuffs." Her desperate shrieks bounced loudly off the high vaulted ceilings, mingling with the pathetic sound of Jamal weeping in the corner. She genuinely believed her biological connection granted her absolute immunity from the devastation she had deliberately engineered. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood still and looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a disease to be managed. Her desperate tears invoked no sympathy within me. I felt only a profound, clarifying emptiness where my pain used to reside. The toxic umbilical cord that had tethered me to their expectations for 3 decades was severed. I studied her ruined face, searching for a single shred of genuine maternal love, but I saw only the terrified panic of a narcissist who had finally run out of victims. I stepped closer to the railing looming over her shaking form. "Blood is just a biological accident, Patricia," I stated, my voice echoing with a freezing, unshakable calm that cut straight through her hysterics. "It is not a blank check for abuse. It does not erase what you did. You made your choice 15 years ago. You made your choice when you threw me out on the streets at 20 because my severe depression embarrassed your social circle. You packed my personal belongings in garbage bags and changed the locks while I was sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room." She choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically as if she could deny the past. But I refused to let her look away. "You told me I was on my own. You told me I needed to learn how the real world works. You called it tough love. You demanded I face the brutality of my own failures without a safety net or a dollar of your money." I leaned down just slightly, making sure my next words were burned into her memory forever. "So enjoy the consequences of your tough love, Patricia. Welcome to the cold, real world." Patricia unleashed a loud, broken wail, collapsing against the bailiff as he pulled her arms behind her back and clamped the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. Richard hung his head, utterly defeated, unable to look at me or his wife, as a second bailiff marched him toward the holding cell door. David Thorne was already being escorted away in silence, his head bowed in absolute disgrace. In the quiet gallery, Melanie sat paralyzed, her eyes wide with shock as she watched our parents being hauled away like common felons, while Jamal continued to sob uncontrollably into his shaking hands. I had given them every opportunity to leave me alone. I had built my corporate empire in the shadows, perfectly content to let them live their shallow lives without my direct interference. They were the ones who brought the war to my doorstep. They were the ones who tried to cage me, steal from me, and completely destroy my sanity. I owed them absolutely nothing. I picked up my leather portfolio, feeling the solid weight of the certified documents inside. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom no longer held any power over me. I had won this battle completely. I slowly turned my back on my mother and the shattered ruins of my family. The sound of Patricia weeping slowly faded behind me. I walked deliberately down the center aisle of the courtroom, my footsteps ringing out with steady, rhythmic confidence against the polished wood. I did not rush. I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy double doors leading to the quiet courthouse corridor and stepped out into the bright, clear light of the afternoon sun. My head was held high, my shoulders squared, finally free to live the extraordinary, magnificent life I had painstakingly built. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me, instantly silencing the wretched wailing of my mother and the frantic shouts of the bailiffs. The courthouse corridor was vast, lined with cold marble, and illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The air out here felt incredibly clean, completely devoid of the suffocating toxicity that had choked my family for decades. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the absolute reality of my victory settle into my bones. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a silent confirmation from my corporate legal team. The trap was set. Right on cue, a sharp chime echoed from the main elevator bank at the far end of the long corridor. The polished steel doors slid open simultaneously. 6 figures marched out, moving with frightening, synchronized precision. They wore dark tactical windbreakers, the bright yellow letters of the FBI emblazoned across their broad backs. Their expressions were stone, their eyes scanning the hallway with predatory focus. They walked straight past me without a single glance, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floor. They were not here for the Reynolds family drama. They were executing a massive federal takedown. I smiled. The courtroom doors burst open again. A local court bailiff emerged, roughly shoving Jamal forward. The disgraced, ruined man was a truly pathetic sight, his expensive custom suit torn and wrinkled, his face slick with sweat and tears. Melanie stumbled out directly behind him, her hands desperately clutching at the back of his ruined jacket. She was sobbing hysterically, begging the bailiff to let them go, entirely oblivious to the federal agents rapidly closing the distance between them. The lead FBI agent stepped directly into Jamal's path, blocking his escape with a solid, unmovable stance. He raised his gold badge. "Jamal Vance," the federal agent announced, his voice a deep, resonant boom that carried down the entire length of the corridor. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated embezzlement, and money laundering." Jamal let out a strangled, very loud gasp. His knees completely buckled, sending him crashing onto the hard marble floor. He did not even try to deny the charges. He knew it was over. My corporate lawyers had delivered a pristine, undeniable dossier of his financial crimes directly to the Boston field office at exactly 8 a.m. this morning. The evidence was absolutely bulletproof and damning. Two agents hauled Jamal back to his feet forcefully, spinning him around and snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Melanie shrieked, lunging forward to grab her husband, but a female agent firmly shoved her back, warning her to stay out of the way. Jamal was marched toward the elevators, his head hanging low, weeping openly like a frightened child. The elevator doors swallowed him, leaving Melanie entirely alone in the vast, echoing hallway. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking violently until she hit a solid wooden bench against the marble wall. She collapsed heavily onto it. My sister looked completely destroyed. Her pristine suburban fantasy had evaporated in a matter of minutes. The yacht, the Aspen vacation home, the country club memberships. All of it was gone, funded by stolen money that the federal government would immediately seize. She had no husband, no parents to bail her out, and no future left in her elite social circles. She was entirely stripped of her wealth and her fabricated status. She looked up from the bench, her ruined, wet-stained face locking onto mine. The arrogant superiority that had defined her entire life was completely and permanently gone. There was no anger left in Melanie's eyes, only absolute, hollow terror. She stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. She opened her mouth, trembling, clearly preparing to beg for my help, to plead for a lifeline from the very sister she had gleefully tortured for 30 years. I did not give her the chance to speak. I simply turned my head away, erasing her from my vision with total indifference. The ultimate punishment for a narcissist is not anger or revenge. It is being rendered completely invisible. She ceased to exist to me entirely. I adjusted the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder and continued walking down the long corridor. My stride was perfectly measured, ringing with undeniable authority. I bypassed the elevators and headed directly for the grand staircase leading to the main exit. The architecture of the courthouse, with its towering columns and sweeping arches, felt less like an imposing fortress and more like a gateway to my actual life. I descended the marble steps smoothly, feeling lighter with every single movement. I was shedding the final lingering remnants of the Reynolds family curse. The nightmare was officially over now. I reached the massive, heavy brass and glass doors of the main courthouse exit. I placed both hands against the cool metal bars and pushed forward with commanding strength. The doors swung open effortlessly. The bright, glaring afternoon sun hit my face, instantly blinding me for a fraction of a second. The crisp, rushing wind off the Boston harbor hit my skin, carrying the scent of salt and absolute freedom. I took a deep, revitalizing breath, letting the fresh air clear the foul stench of desperation from my lungs. The world outside was vibrant, chaotic, and completely mine to conquer. A sleek, black chauffeured SUV was idling perfectly at the curb, its hazard lights blinking a steady rhythm. As I stepped down the final granite stairs, the tinted rear passenger window slid down with a quiet hum. My executive assistant sat inside, holding a glowing tablet filled with urgent global market updates. She looked up, her expression a mask of sharp readiness. "Where to, Ms. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice crisp and efficient. I paused on the sidewalk, turning to look back at the courthouse one last time.